So we want to let everybody know that the session's being recorded. Microphones are muted. To engage, you can raise your hand or type into chat. There is a closed captioning option that you can see below on your menu bar. It says CC. If you have additional input, as always, please send Susan an email that she can share with this stakeholder group. Next slide. Again, to use chat, it's on the menu bar. It should be located at the bottom of your screen. You can click on chat, type a message. Everybody will be able to see it. Next slide. Raise hand, you go to reactions and you click the raise hand icon, and then we will be monitoring for that and we'll call on you. Next slide. So today at meeting 5, we're going to give a brief overview of what we heard throughout the entire engagement process. Susan's going to provide an overview of the recommendations that you received and hopefully had a chance to review prior to this meeting. And the rest of the meeting, the bulk of the meeting, is going to be focused on group feedback on the recommendations. And we have set up breakout rooms so we can be in smaller groups and have a chance to hear from everybody on the call today. And we'll close out with next steps. Next slide. Just a reminder that DLCD has brought together community members and other experts who've been affected by wildfire to inform staff recommendations to the statewide Wildfire Programs Advisory Council and legislature. And your role is to share your unique experiences and views with DLCD on wildfire mitigation efforts to increase the safety and health of all Oregonians. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Libby. Good morning. My name is Susan Milhauser, and I'm a natural hazards planner focused on wildfire with the Department of Land Conservation and Development and the staff lead for our Wildfire Adapted Communities project. If you folks want to take a moment and introduce yourselves by putting your name and affiliation, if any, in the chat, that would be great. And we're really glad to have folks here today for our last meeting. We have a lot of good information to talk through with you and get your feedback on. In a moment, Sadie Carney is going to share a land acknowledgement with us. And after Sadie does that, we've invited Doug Graff, the Wildfire Programs Director, to just give us all a brief update on the status of the statewide map of wildfire risk. And during Doug's few minutes, he's happy to answer a few clarifying questions if there are any. However, we'd really like to focus the bulk of our meeting on the land use recommendations. And so during the recommendations overview, I will touch on how DLCD is approaching the risk map in our recommendations. And I'm going to turn it over to Sadie. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Susan. And like Susan said, thank you everyone for taking time to be here this morning, and especially to our state agency partners and Director Graff, our Wildfire Programs Director for the state, for joining us today. Your knowledge and participation is really valued, so just want to express my gratitude. So I will start our meeting by reading our land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the many tribes and bands who call Oregon their ancestral territory and honor the ongoing relationship between the land, plants, animals, and people indigenous to this place we now call Oregon. We recognize the continued sovereignty of the 9 federally recognized tribes who have ties to this place and thank them for continuing to teach us how we might all be here together.
All right, next slide. And then Doug, if you would like to say a few words, that would be great. And we've included on this slide the risk mapping webpage for Oregon Department of Forestry, where there will be updates at a future date.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks for the kind words here, folks. Glad to be here, support and listen in. I'll give a brief update that was given to the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council on Friday on the status of the wildfire risk map, given that's a pivotal and key element in the implementation of Senate Bill 762, which really drives some downstream implementation. So there's a lot of interest in the current status of the map. So appreciate the opportunity to just share as broadly as I can on the current status since the Department of Forestry on August 4th. I hit a pause on both the mapping development and the appeals process in order to regroup to ensure a product and delivery that's more effective. So a couple adjustments in process. Once again, I highlighted at the council last week is really putting expertise in the group and coordination across agencies to ensure alignment on the communication strategy. Public meeting engagement is step one. There's a really key element in a fundamental shift in the development of the map. The first display of the map was completed on a tight timeline and then immediately went to appeals. So the shift in the next phase of development would be to deliver a draft map and locally provide some review opportunities, engagement with the communities and public to see and understand what the map is and what the map is not, and how it will be used, and then make any adjustments based on that review locally. So that's a significant shift. The fourth piece here in the process would be relooking at the appeals. Really was an overwhelming element when the map landed for the department. So restructuring the appeals to be a more effective way where the agency can be responsive. There was in the range of, I think, 1,600 plus engagements there on the appeals. So needing to be ready to address significant public input is important. And we need to complete this work going into the session, next full session, and to ensure that we have meaningful deliberation and that there's any adjustments made to the map necessary, or any of the rules to support effective implementation. And in order to get there, we want a complete map and a complete process done so we can evaluate together if there's any fine-tune adjustments. So that's the engagement the agency will be working through. Of course, they'll work closely with the two agencies that have really the map's purpose to drive downstream community protection measures of hardening of homes, and through the state fire marshal and defensible space. That's defensible space through the state fire marshal, and then hardening of homes through DCBS. Both of those are, where we apply those defense measures are driven by the classifications within the map. So that's really the importance of the map. And dispositioning the conversation around insurance was really important and drove the pause also on the front end. So the insurance commissioner has stepped in a significant way there to lead that conversation. So there's a lot of pieces in play. There's kind of the overall summary, and I will be listening in best I can, Susan. I do have 10 o'clock to 10:30 that I'll have to step out for, but largely listening in for the day. Back to you, Susan.
Great. Thanks very much, Doug. We really appreciate that update. So the next couple of slides, we just have some reminders of DLCD's charge under Senate Bill 762, which all of you who have been participating over the last couple of months, you're super familiar with. But just again to reiterate that we are putting together recommended changes for state land use planning program and local comprehensive plans and zoning codes to incorporate wildfire risk maps and minimize wildfire risk. We're also looking at identifying state and local resources necessary for implementation. And, the recommendations can address defensible space, building code, safe evacuation, and development considerations. And so that's really what we've touched on in our preliminary recommendations that we're discussing today, with the primary emphasis on the safe evacuation and development considerations. Next slide, please. And here's just a quick, again, overview of the timeline. This report is due to the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council and Director Graf and the legislature October 1st for their consideration. And it may be that there is legislation in the 2023 session based on these recommendations. And if there is direction from the legislature and in working with our commission, Land Conservation and Development Commission, there may be some rulemaking to follow. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Sadie.
Thanks, Susan. So this section of slides, really, we intended to capture what we've heard in our stakeholder group meetings with this group, what we heard in our community listening sessions, in our tribal consultation, and from our commission when we presented to them at their July meeting. So we can start rolling through the slides here. So the major themes that came through to our staff in the outreach and engagement process, and I'll pause at the end. So if you are looking through these ideas that we've captured here and you're thinking, wow, I heard something that really just didn't show up on these slides, you'll have an opportunity to let us know. Or feel free to put it in the chat, though when I'm looking at the slides, I'm not always paying attention to the chat, but somebody always is. So rest assured, those ideas will come through. And I will say what we've captured and reflected here is kind of what's within our purview to act while sort of staying true to our charge under Senate Bill 762. So there were occasions on which we heard, let's just see what happens if we let defensible space and home hardening go along on its own, and we don't make any adjustments to land use. And so while we did hear that, we haven't reflected it here because it does not help us meet our statutory obligation under Senate Bill 762, because we're required to make recommendations on changes to land use practices at the state and local level. So while we did hear that, you won't see that on these slides, and that's the reason. Anyway, overwhelmingly, we have found that Oregonians in all parts of the state, for lots of different reasons, are concerned about wildfire. They are eager to take action at a community and personal level, and they're really looking for resources, guidance, and opportunities to do that. We've heard equity considerations. We've heard that from this group, from our community stakeholder meetings, and from our commission. Just a broad sort of suite of needs, from information access to evacuation needs to equitable engagement practices in planning for a future for a wildfire adapted Oregon. We've heard the need, really, I think, in our community listening sessions. Director Graf just brought this up, the need for interagency coordination in terms of how we communicate with the public, how we collaborate with each other, and how sort of our service to Oregonians can be improved by having a single source of information and a unified message. So related to that, accessible and reliable education and communications, we've heard, and I think we've seen as we've watched how the map has actually fit with the landscape, a one-size-fits-all approach won't work. We do need to really consider both individual needs of community members in that local planning process and regional differences around the state. And then sort of countering that, there is benefits to having a consistent application. And I think we see that, I think we see a good model of that with our partners at DCBS and the Building Codes Division. And they can explain to you, maybe in a separate time, why that consistency is beneficial to the state overall. Community-specific evacuation planning that allows for different needs is something that we heard. So both, the specific needs of the community, the specific needs of individuals within the community, the specific needs of that transportation network. So we can go to the next slide. There is the potential for conflicting development considerations. We heard that, and I think we heard it with this group, related to, for those folks familiar with House Bill 2001, that's a missing middle housing bill. And it is the state directing local governments to densify housing opportunities. Well, is there a conflict if we have an area that is at risk to wildfire? Do we want to put more homes in those locations? How do we strike that balance? And so I think that's an important one for us to keep in mind and really to elevate through the process as it moves forward. Balancing private property rights interests, the needs of individuals, and broad community benefits. So there's a lot to consider as we move forward, both meeting the needs of individuals, property developers, property owners, and keeping our communities safe. Statewide planning that's flexible for local communities. That's sort of the one size fits all. Lack of requirements such as defensible space and access to resources in areas not identified. So we have extreme or high risk, though we are kind of trying to adjust our approach based on the current state of the map. So, but what we heard from people is, with the current implementation of Senate Bill 762, where defensible space and home hardening only exists in high or extreme risk areas, what about their neighbors who are moderate risk? Or what about a community that is moderate risk today because there was a large fire in recent past, but will again move to higher extreme in the coming years? How do we plan for a long-term future that is effective and wildfire adapted in Oregon? We heard about, and thank you to our local planners who are on this call, the need for resources, funding, staff, maybe model code for local governments and for community members. And part of that is with, the education and information availability piece. And tied to that is the equity, right? Wildfire resilient infrastructure like and utilities like water and electricity are something, especially from our wildfire impacted communities and community members. We have heard the need for us to be mindful of those infrastructure requirements and needs in that space. So we can move to the next slide. So we have had many conversations throughout this process with tribal partners, and those conversations are ongoing. We will be following up with them after we've taken our feedback from you, from this group on these recommendations, and incorporating those into our recommendations, making adjustments based on what we hear today. So after we have gone through that exercise, we will share out a revised version of the recommendations, including to our tribal partners. And we're in the process of setting up meetings with them to walk through the recommendations, familiarize them with them, and take their comments on what we've heard. But what we have heard in our conversations so far with these groups is there's a real need for us to be mindful as we move forward, I think as an enterprise, not just as land use practitioners, of how we protect and manage cultural resource sites. So Doug may know this, and others from ODF may know this. There's something called inadvertent discovery, and that can happen a lot when you are out in the wilderness managing wildfire. And so how can we help our tribes protect cultural assets like ancestral burial grounds, for example, through this process and in this process? for us to be mindful of wildfire impacts to tribal members living in the wildland urban interface, access to resources for defensible space. I know we have our partners at OSFM, and thank you, working on that, but that is and we're happy to put you in touch with these folks, but that's a specific concern from tribes. Safe evacuation, tribal lands and federally managed lands are sometimes adjacent. And how do we coordinate transportation needs between those two entities to ensure safe evacuation and equipment access? Long-range land use planning impacts to tribal fee lands. This is a bit above my pay grade. I'm not 100% tracking all what those impacts could look like, but we will be mindful for them. And thankfully we have experts on staff that can help us manage that process moving forward. Impacts to tribal trust lands from adjacent land use changes, ensuring that lands that will be developed are planned to reduce risk. This is kind of like neighbors to tribal lands. So if there is development either within or outside tribal lands, ensuring that it reduces risk for everyone involved. And then finally, and this kind of relates to the first bullet or check mark, access to geographic information system data. So tribal governments are interested in being able to use the information that is captured in the risk map and to pair that with their own spatial data that helps them locate, define, and manage their cultural resource sites and cultural assets. And so having access to that information is something that's important to them. So next we'll talk about our LCDC feedback, and that's the next slide. Oh no, I take it back. This is recovery and rebuilding, which we did hear a lot about from our commission members, but helping people remain in their communities. I just had some long and detailed conversations while I was on vacation last week with some folks from Detroit who had lost, houses that were right next to each other. And they were telling me about the challenges of rebuilding from an insurance perspective, from a supply chain perspective, and how they were, afraid they were going to run out of time to rebuild or get these claims processed through their insurance. So how do we work together as an enterprise, and what can we do from a land use perspective to help people remain in their communities? Clear and coordinated information sharing, building back better. So how can we improve living situations, especially in rural communities, for people that have been impacted? Can we rebuild in a way that is equitable or more equitable to ensure better access to affordable housing? We want to rebuild in ways that are cost effective and also provide energy efficient homes for kind of that long-term sustainability, both from a individual cost perspective, but also as we look at our resource use overall. How and where we rebuild, more fire resistant communities. And we've heard in this group, and I really appreciated this feedback, places that are subject to multiple hazards. So we know that in places that have experienced wildfire, they're more prone to landslides, they're more, or debris slides, they're more prone to flooding. And the landscape itself is less resilient. How do we think about that and incorporate that into our rebuilding efforts? And how do we shore up our utilities? Electricity is an example that's cited specifically in Senate Bill 762, but we've heard about a lot of barriers related to sewer and septic systems. We have heard, the need for broadband and information access. So there's a broad set of utilities to consider. So we can move to the next slide. And then in addition, at a community level, how do we help cities deal with the revenue loss related to a wildfire? Temporary disruption in businesses. I heard a great story, and this was a while ago, about a rafting company on the Rogue River that had to cancel all of their trips. And the owner of the company showed up, I forget what you call kind of your incident management fire camp. I think there's a special word for it, but he showed up at the meetings every morning and finally struck a partnership with some of our firefighters to deliver resources up and down river using the Rogue River and their rafts, and to somehow get compensated. But that's one story, right? How do we make those stories more common? And how do we help communities recover from the financial loss? We have heard from communities who have been impacted by wildfire that they are ready to update and strengthen their wildland urban interface strategies and codes. There's a strong sense of not wanting it to happen again. And so how do we empower local governments to do that, empower communities to do that, and give them the tools to make it easy? And finally, updating natural hazards mitigation plans in partnership with local government and tribes as part of the recovery and rebuilding. I think when a community has experienced a wildfire and been impacted, their sense of the hazard changes. And so there's an opportunity to update the NHMP in a way that's really mindful and potentially very helpful for future community members when you're in that recovery space. Oh, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat. So next slide, and this I think is LCDC. So our commissioners, I am so grateful to them. They are some of the hardest working volunteers in state government, in my opinion. But what we heard from them is that research demonstrates that involving community members, involving individuals who will be included in a plan and impacted by a plan, involving them in the planning process increases the buy-in and increases the overall outcomes. You achieve the outcomes you're aiming to. Equitable outcomes rely upon equitable engagement, was a very strong feedback we heard from our commission. And this was, I thought, very, I internalized this comment very deeply, and I thought that it was delivered well from our commission chair. So working directly with individuals and communities who have been impacted by wildfire to best understand how a community needs to prepare. So our commission chair had worked directly in a planning capacity with survivors of Katrina. And what she went in thinking the community needs would be turned out to be completely wrong. And it was by connecting with individuals on the ground, families, neighborhoods on the ground who had been impacted, that they really learned what a community needs to do to prepare. And so I thought that that was just, and we internalized that deeply, and we're really taking steps to connect with those communities, especially as we move forward with this process. We heard from one of our coastal commissioners whose community was impacted by wildfire. They had all been preparing for the tsunami, and they were completely unprepared for a wildfire, and they lost hundreds of homes. And she said, when I look at this wildfire risk map, I think about the people who are in low or moderate areas who perceive themselves as safe and might not really understand that they're not, that a fire can happen anytime, anywhere. So they ask us to be mindful of that false sense of safety when fire is so unpredictable. Okay, we can go to the next slide. We heard from a commissioner who has had many years in a community development space that model codes and policies for local governments can be very helpful in moving them forward in making changes to local land use plans. And also, I think if I skip a bullet down, to be mindful of community capacity and local government capacity. we the state and we DLCD ask a lot of local governments, and we need to be mindful of that as we move forward and make sure that we have the resources available to help them implement this work. Focus on moving back up to the second bullet, they asked us to focus our recommendations to things that are specific to land use. And when we had other guidance that might be appropriate for partner agencies, that we share that directly with the agencies rather than put it into a legislative report with recommendations. So that's something we'll do moving forward. To provide local governments resources. Providing local government resources isn't enough when there aren't people to do the work. So that gets back to that local government capacity and implementation. And finally, to work closely with communities developing implementation timelines. This is generational work. It will take years to implement. It will take years to do right. And so they asked us to be mindful of that and to have both the patience and sort of the conscientious approach moving forward. So I think that's maybe it for me, but maybe there's one more slide. Let's check. Oh, all right. I'll pause to see if there's any questions on that. I'll go on mute and maybe check in on what's been happening in the chat. But if folks have questions, feel free to raise your hand or to put something in the chat now. I'll try to scroll back over the next few minutes. And if we don't hear anything, then Susan, I'll turn it over to you.
I think,
Great.
yeah.
Great, thanks, Sadie. Yeah, no, I don't see any hands. All right, thank you for that overview. Yeah, I think and I will respond to just a couple of the chats. I think having the overall context has been helpful in our focus on the land use recommendations. So really to understand kind of that recovery context and, some of the issues that have been raised through the engagement process are not directly in our purview, but I think having that bigger picture has been very helpful. And people did spend time sharing their concerns with us, and we do want to capture that in our report. And we will have an appendix that just talks about some of the topics that were raised that are outside of our purview, but we want to make sure we're cataloging that, so people know that they have been heard, and the legislature will see that. And as Sadie mentioned, sharing directly with some other state agencies as appropriate. All right, so I'm going to spend some time talking about our preliminary draft recommendations that we shared with you all on Friday. We'll take there's 6 recommendations. Some of them have a lot more detail than others that we want to talk with you about, which we'll do in our small groups. But as I'm going through kind of each of the recommendations at a high level, I'm happy to take any clarifying questions or brief comments. But if we could hold a more in-depth conversation to the small groups, that would be great. So if we could go to the next slide, please. All right, so we have established a set of guiding principles that have come out of some of our earlier stakeholder group meetings when we did some polling, our community survey. We asked questions that helped us really frame up some guiding principles that have helped us as we are developing the recommendations, which are based on the extensive community and stakeholder engagement, research into best practices that we've discussed at some of our prior meetings, including some policies that currently are used by Oregon jurisdictions, those 2020 wildfire recovery lessons, and the feedback from the Land Conservation and Development Commission. And then these guiding principles really have helped us just frame up and help kind of put a little container around what we're recommending. But at the top of the list, and I think number one is protecting human life. That is really the highest priority or principle that we're ascribing to. I think some of the other principles, maybe we could quibble about the order of importance, but really at the top of the list is protecting human life from the growing risks of wildfires. We really are hoping that some of the recommendations, in the long term can help Oregon communities better withstand and recover from wildfire, so become more resilient. As we know, this risk is growing, and it's not whether or not there will be wildfires in the future, but where and how prepared are our communities. We really are engaged and focused on achieving equitable outcomes and increasing community capacity. And so that could be through engagement, that can be through how recommendations are put forth and communities are involved in developing local solutions. And we really do want to, and as an agency, have been focused on paying attention to historically and currently underserved and under-resourced communities, because we know when we're meeting the needs of folks who are most vulnerable, we're really helping the community overall be better prepared and more resilient. The fourth one is protecting and increasing the resilience of important infrastructure and community assets. So what are things in our communities, like those important, water lines or water treatment plant or other utilities or community assets that are really important for a community to survive and really important to recovery. Those are, folks don't always think about infrastructure first thing, but that's really the backbone of our communities. And so how can we help make that more resilient through land use strategies? Really also very important, protecting the places where people live, work, and gather. And I think I maybe borrowed that phrase from our colleagues at the Office of State Fire Marshal, but really, we had this long list, we need to protect people's homes and their businesses and all these other important things. It's like, well, no, it's like, where are people? Where do they live? Where do they work? Where do they spend time? Those are the places that we need to focus our attention. And, in keeping with some of our feedback, really guided by the principle of working with our local communities to identify any regional or local differences within the context of the statewide land use planning program and our statewide planning goals to mitigate wildfire risk. And then lastly, and not least, really seriously considering the local capacity to implement any of these recommendations and what type of state support might be needed to put additional wildfire mitigation measures in place. And I think, next slide, please. All right, so our recommendations are grouped into these 5 categories. The first one falls under community information and engagement. And then we have 2 recommendations around safe evacuation and firefighting response. And then we have a pretty big detailed recommendation under the 3rd bullet, wildfire risk mitigation requirements for areas of new development. And then we talk about some recommendations around recovery planning. And then our last recommendation is focused more broadly on planning for natural hazards under statewide planning goal 7. And so for each of these, the first 4 recommendations, we have 2 options. And for the last 2, it's more broad policy work. So there's really only one option. But for where there is more than one option, option A is really we're trying to frame up a regulatory approach where the legislature would provide policy direction to our commission, to our agency, with some sidebars for the commission to undertake rulemaking with a really robust community engagement process to help define what we're really talking about and establish minimum land use requirements, as well as direction and funding to support city and county implementation through grant funding and technical assistance. And then option B is really more of a voluntary pathway where cities and counties could opt in to develop approaches to meet minimum actions or outcomes that still the agency would need to establish, because we have to have a kind of a baseline. And then communities that have opted in could access grant funding and technical assistance. And then those types of implementation supports or tools in the toolbox, include some specific strategies that can support implementation. And then we go into the needed resources. And I will take a moment here to note that One of our charges under Senate Bill 762 was to make recommendations regarding incorporating wildfire risk maps. And at this point, we are awaiting kind of the next iteration of the statewide map of wildfire risk before we really dive into how local governments may want to incorporate, or how it makes sense within the statewide land use planning program to incorporate the wildfire risk map. And so we don't include that in a recommendation right now. And depending on the timing of the rollout of the updated map, it may or may not be included in our reports to the legislature, but we'll make it clear that that's certainly something that we still need to address. And then you may have noticed in some of the recommendations, we do refer to kind of areas of greatest wildfire risk. We really did need a way to talk about where, in particular, mitigation requirements for areas of new development would make the most sense for having applicability. And so we did talk about areas of greatest wildfire risk, which is not referring to the risk map, but is a way to say, areas where there is higher risk, it would make sense to have these types of standards versus areas where there is little to no risk. So I hope that makes sense. And I can talk through that a little more when we get to the recommendations. And then the last thing I'll note is over the next month, we are really working closely with outside experts, local government partners, and other state agency partners to narrow down a range of needed resources that would support these recommendations. Looking at similar types of grant and technical assistance programs that DLCD currently offers. And we are working on gathering some base information, and we'll be developing a short survey for our local government partners over the coming weeks to help us refine that needed resources piece. All right, next slide, please. So as Sadie mentioned in some of what we heard, we really have focused our first recommendation on prioritizing robust and inclusive community information and engagement in planning efforts to create wildfire adapted communities. So this is not only at the local, city and county level, but in the work that DLCD may do moving forward to develop any rules or guidance or other tools to support local governments. And as mentioned, really, for communities to be successful in mitigating wildfire risk, the more people that are involved in the effort, better, the better, knowing different needs of different community members, different abilities to be engaged, and the resources needed to be better prepared are critical in developing plans for reducing risk. And so really the kernel of this recommendation is that cities and counties would be asked to use best practices and a meaningful participatory process to engage their community members, particularly from traditionally underserved and underrepresented communities. And in the more detailed recommendations document that you all received, we do go into some detail about what DLCD at this point in time thinks would really be important elements of a robust and inclusive community information and engagement strategy. So really providing important information upfront to public officials about community vulnerabilities and capabilities and preferences. So does everyone in the community who's involved in the process understand why or where different parts of the community are more vulnerable to wildfire risk, and the factors that go into that? Are there planning activities that can help serve as educational opportunities as well to help develop consensus and buy-in? So can the planning process not only help inform a long-term plan for a community, but in that process, people who are engaged also are learning about, how they can be individually prepared, for a wildfire or other natural hazard, and the types of behaviors that can help them as individuals be better adapted. We also have, again, talked about building resilience in the community as a whole through intentionally including those underrepresented and underserved groups to really empower and build capacity. We also, through DLCD's practices, would encourage local governments to, if they're having an advisory group or, a committee that's helping them with their planning efforts, really to seek to have representatives on that advisory body or group that really represent the community as a whole demographically. It can be hard to do that sometimes. People have different levels and abilities to volunteer for planning processes, but we have some, good guidance about how to do that, and certainly would be developing tools to help local governments. And the last couple things are really focusing on local expertise to help inform policies, ground truthing, if you will, how the different types of requirements would play out on the ground, and that can help increase ownership and legitimacy for our wildfire mitigation planning efforts, and also, create a program that is going to be most effective. And really having community education and materials and events that are going out into the community, meeting people where they are. Really, these are some best practices around community engagement. And so how do we inform and engage people, not expecting them to come, to a public meeting or spending 3 hours of their day like you all are on this stakeholder group. And lastly, really developing strategies with special attention to, if we're talking about like evacuation planning and response, special attention to residents and visitors who maybe are elderly or have mobility challenges or other have some form of disability, limited transportation, or may have limited English proficiency. So that's a lot, and I'm going to pause for a second if folks have any questions. All right, I don't see anything, and I will. Oh yes, Jim, please.
Yeah, wasn't sure again where to insert this question, but maybe I've missed a piece in this. But the full set of recommendations, whether it's Plan A, Plan B, regulatory versus volunteer, what's the scope of these recommendations? I mean, are you planning on coming forward with applying these for the entire WUI, for the risk classifications, or what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so great question. For this first recommendation, the thinking behind it is for communities that would be required or opt in to do wildfire mitigation planning efforts, then they would be required or opt in to use, inclusive engagement strategies. As we get further into the recommendations, there are some specific recommendations where we really are focused on the extreme and high or areas of greatest wildfire risk. I'll rephrase that. But this is kind of more broad for any communities that are engaging in that type of planning effort. We would strive to have some overall engagement. Potentially it could be rulemaking, or it could be a set of guidelines, really depending on if we're talking about option A or option B.
It would be awesome if you could make that really clear
Okay.
In these recommendations, because it's hard to understand the context when maybe some of these things are either assumed or implied or buried somewhere in the text.
Yeah, that's great. And I will add to any kind of feedback like that from folks is super helpful, because we're so buried in the detail that kind of higher level feedback is very helpful.
So we have
Thanks, Jim.
Mary Kyle, and then Samantha.
Thanks. Jim's really good question made me think that another layer of the answer to that, particularly in this area, and I know you're trying to give a menu of voluntary and required things, but blending Jim's question with what I think Sadie said was a reflection of LCDC Commissioner Jacobson, who's a Lincoln County commissioner also. about how unprepared the coast was for a wildfire makes me think, there may be a level of things that are required or right out paid for in certain areas of the state of highest wildfire risk, to use the generic term, I don't know, but other areas where it's encouraged and you could get grant money for it. I'm thinking of places like the coast who are still not likely to rate very risky on the maps, but to encourage this kind of planning anyway. So it just seems between regulatory and voluntary, there's a incentive-based approach also for areas that might not be as at highest risk. But we've learned it would be good to do this, and probably for more reasons than just wildfire, right?
All right, Samantha.
So this is kind of tacking on to what Jim was just saying about providing some more clarity. I think given how much attention this issue is going to have from the public who's not normally in like a policy making space, it's I think incumbent that when the recommendations are finalized and released, that they are written as simple and concise and clear as possible. Really making clear what the intent is, what the scope is, and to provide sufficient detail so that people really understand exactly what is being proposed, simply because I think just given kind of how the rollout has gone thus far, anything that's kind of vague, I just would hate that people, we should just be very clear about what the full intent is and what's not.
Great. Thank you, Samantha and Mary Kyle. Very helpful. All right. Looks like we can go. Oh, wait, I see some hands. All right. Dave, yeah.
Thanks, Susan. I'm just trying to figure out if the department is recommending that all local governments, regardless of risk classification, do require wildfire planning for all areas of their jurisdiction, again, regardless of risk classification. And if that's what you're proposing, are you going to require that through Goal 7 rulemaking?
Unmuting myself here. Yeah, Dave, I think we are not recommending that all communities across Oregon do wildfire mitigation planning at this point in time. There are the recommendation related to development standards for areas of new development that would apply to the areas of higher risk, but not areas of lower risk. And as I mentioned, something about how you do that planning then would apply to those communities that are doing the planning work. The next two recommendations, oh my goodness, sorry. Hopefully that's not too loud, are about safe evacuation and firefighting response. And those two recommendations we do believe make sense to look at community-wide, and we would ask that communities across the state would engage in that type of assessment and planning effort. What we haven't gotten into detail about, and I think we can, as we're talking more with our local government partners, it may make sense to have like a phasing process for that. So communities that are at higher risk, when we do have the map coming back, when the map comes back out, that would make sense for those communities to prioritize that type of transportation planning effort related to evacuation, and kind of then phase it, down to communities that maybe are at lower risk.
Sadie?
Yeah, I would just echo what Susan said, absent a map, it's really hard to say where exactly this might apply and what we would prioritize. I don't think that it would be every community across the state, but we're really looking for legislative direction on something like that, in terms of inclusion, in terms of phasing, in terms of timing, et cetera. And that's, where we're directing these recommendations. So hopefully there will be more thought given to the issue, including yours. So appreciate the feedback.
Thank you, Susan.
Great. So I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah. So these next two recommendations are, we are looking at safe evacuation and firefighting response. And a lot of what we heard during the community engagement, as well as our research into best practices, was, in some communities, the existing transportation network has issues. There are roads that aren't well maintained. Firefighters and other first responders can't access an area easily. That takes some longer time to get in there, which reduces survivability of people's homes. And really critically important is what are the opportunities for people to evacuate safely. And so we're really trying to focus on ways that cities and counties could assess their existing transportation networks to identify any gaps or deficiencies that may hinder safe evacuation of residents and visitors, and efficient access for firefighters to get in to respond. And then through that gap identification, then we would ask cities and counties to look at needed amendments to transportation system plans, maintenance and operation plans, and policies and programs to address those deficiencies over time. We understand that that those types of improvements take funding, so capital improvement plans and other planning documents would need to be reviewed and funding addressed.
You have a question in the chat.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, great question, Kurt. I'll read it out. So please discuss whose recommendations these are and how this task force will impact the recommendations. Excellent question. So these recommendations are coming from the Department of Land Conservation and Development based on, input from this group over the last couple of months, our community engagement, direction from our commission, and the agency itself is tasked with making those recommendations to the legislature and the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council. And this stakeholder group, what we are hoping for today is the kind of feedback that you all have been giving us, so about how the recommendations are presented, are there, and we have some questions we will share with you before we go into small groups, are we identifying the right types of elements for the different recommendations? What is missing? And so taking the feedback from you all today and updating the recommendations that will go into the draft recommendations report that will be available to the public on Friday. And then there's a 1-month public comment period. So we'll take continued public comment, meeting with different stakeholders, as Sadie mentioned, circling back with our tribal representatives to refine those recommendations. And then we have one more meeting with our commission in September to kind of get their feedback. The Land Conservation and Development Commission is not required to take action on the recommendations report. We're really looking to them more as a sounding board and providing direction. But it's really the agency's recommendations based on all of the feedback we're receiving.
All right, and we have Mary Kyle has her hand up.
Hi, thanks. One thing in how this was written up in the longer report made me have a recommendation across the report. At one point in your staff report, it says a range of specific strategies would be developed. And if you could always throughout this report make clear where you can, who would be developing the strategies. So for example, if the state is doing it, as a tool to provide to local governments, or if you're expecting it of local government to do it. So, removing the passive voice. And then secondly, for this particular one, you talk about, and I think this is great, the cities and counties assessing their transportation networks, but clearly there's a regional aspect to this, which is multi-county and city. And I think that should be reflected in terms of, actual safe evacuation and firefighting response. And Central Oregon, Southwestern Oregon. Those are multiple counties.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I will note that ultimately, for our recommendations, a final action or direction to the department rests with the legislature. So we are really preparing this report for the legislature. And I'll also note that the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council will be reviewing our recommendations report, and they have their own process where they're also making recommendations to the legislature.
Right. I understand you all are not taking any actions here except making recommendations. And I do think it's your responsibility to give a menu of different levels. And so if there's an agreement to add a regional transportation aspect here, and that's challenging under current structures, I think that's worthy of some things like that. That's an example of something I would recommend flagging for the legislature, those types of things where there might be an additional tool or direction needed from the legislature. If, there was an agreement that this is something to do. This is just one example. I'm sure there will be a couple others throughout here.
Susan, you have two other questions in the chat from Kelly and Melanie.
All right. Yes, I'm reading Kelly's question. Is recommendation 2 being proposed in the Oregon Fire Code in addition to Goal 12? So, Kelly, I think we get more into the Oregon Fire Code with the next transportation related recommendation, and that's a little more focused. That's more focused on actual like site development standards, access, ingress and egress, and what is in the Oregon Fire Code, which we're not proposing, to change, but just bringing to light for cities and counties as they're doing future planning, considering, additional requirements that address that access. So hopefully that makes sense. But really this recommendation number 2 is more broadly looking at the transportation network as a whole and where there may be gaps or deficiencies.
Okay, and then a general question, are emergency managers in counties and cities already tasked with creating at least a basic emergency evacuation plan for their areas?
Let's see, how would that? Yeah, so yes, Melanie, definitely emergency managers and are already creating, emergency evacuation plans. And this recommendation really we were trying to determine, what's something that's really within the land use and transportation planning arena to support the work that those emergency managers are already doing. And to, I think, answer your second question, we believe that a recommendation to require this broadly is a good idea, so that in the event of a wildfire emergency or any number of other emergencies, the transportation network is more able to meet those needs in the future.
All right, are there any other questions? Or Susan, are you ready for recommendation number 3, or is there more to cover?
Yeah, I think just the last thing I'll mention on number 2 is that, again, and we talked about this at a past meeting, we're envisioning that with this type of assessment by local governments and potentially, regional transportation or regional metropolitan planning organizations who are looking more broadly at a region, are there opportunities to like facilitate agreements in advance, for between public and private landowners for people to evacuate from certain areas, maybe on private roads or roads that are locked, just again, having that knowledge in advance and having conversations in advance would be really important. All right. Yeah, I think in the thinking about time, I will keep moving on. There are some more details in the written material we provided on Friday, so we can talk about those in more detail in the breakout groups. So yeah, recommendation number 3. And this gets more at reviewing and amending local codes to ensure safe evacuation and that efficient access for firefighting response. So are there opportunities in consultation for cities and counties in consultation with state and local emergency and fire protection professionals to review and amend zoning and land division codes that apply, to future development to increase street connectivity and site access for new development. So using that Oregon Fire Code, which was mentioned, I think I have the reference. It's Oregon Fire Code Appendix D. Making sure that new development really is looking carefully at that street connectivity and access, particularly street connectivity from what we've learned from past wildfire events. Areas that had only one way in or one way out were much more highly impacted when it came to evacuation and emergency response. And so can we harness opportunities in new development to create a more grid-like or connected street network to provide more options for people to get in or get out? I will note that we did include under this recommendation, and this group has talked a little bit about, there are many counties have permits for special events or outdoor mass gatherings where the local fire protection district would review those event plans, and we just want to call out and make sure that local governments are looking at their existing standards or permitting process to make sure that fire protection and ingress and egress standards are included in their existing processes for those temporary use permits for special events. So just to make sure that that need for additional egress and ingress is elevated at the local government level. And throughout, this recommendation and then the following one, we understand that there may be places because of geography or other factors that the standards might not be able to apply. So we are recommending that a waiver process be developed that a local government could use, or that DLCD may develop a waiver process for local government implementation, which could include, requiring additional wildfire mitigation standards.
All right, Dave has his hand up.
Thanks. Susan, is this recommendation intended to apply to all new development, or just, the larger development subdivisions and commercial and maybe larger residential uses, as opposed to a application for a single family dwelling in a farm, forest, or rural residential zone?
Yeah, great question. It is, we really are thinking about larger development. There already are standards for individual developments in farm and forest. And we would, though, want to look more carefully about the site access and, driveway grade and things like that that are needed for firefighting equipment to access someone's home site. And so that is something that's already in many county codes for, and particularly the forest zones. So this recommendation would capture that need to potentially make sure that those access standards are applied more broadly where it makes sense in areas of high and extreme risk. But really, this recommendation is looking at a larger development. And under the fire 2019 fire code, there are specific thresholds for the different types of access roads and, hydrant spacing that already exists for, multifamily or commercial development.
All right, Samantha Bayer.
This is kind of what Jim was asking earlier. So for this one, are you contemplating that this would be applied jurisdiction wide or just in the wildland urban interface areas?
This we think would make sense jurisdiction wide. Because as we've seen with some of the 2020 wildfires, areas that were, moderate risk were impacted by wildfire, or people were, asked to evacuate in the event that a fire spread into their neighborhood. So it really makes sense to us that street connectivity, and site access standards should be reviewed across the community.
And this would be for new development only, or for rebuild as well?
Rebuilding would be considered new development.
Okay.
Yeah.
So say
a
like
major
down
remodel.
in places in Southern Oregon, we're still rebuilding large communities. This may apply there.
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be, you know, codified by the local government
Mhm.
prior to being effective. So something that's, you know, certainly like rebuilding now, it wouldn't apply, which I don't think you're applying, but yeah, oh, Dave had the same question in the chat. It looks like, hopefully I just answered that, Dave.
Well, it's for remodels, I think is a little bit different.
Oh, remodels. Yeah, no, I think, let's see, Palmer's also, thank you. So many chats. I think like a remodel of a single family home. No, I think anything that, and these are the types of questions that I think were we to enter into rulemaking, we could certainly address at a much higher level of detail. But for, you know, a remodel, if a land use review isn't triggered, then, you know, it would be, you know, a land use related requirement couldn't be applied, if I'm making sense. So for example, if someone is, you know, switching out their windows, or they, you know, they're trying to harden their home, you know, to R327 building code standard, and they're not triggering any land use review, then, you know, these types of requirements would not be applicable.
Okay, Samantha, you've had your hand up. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sam Signer here, filling in for Evan, representing the Oregon Wine Council. I'm curious as to how some of these codes would potentially apply to existing structures you mentioned, as well as temporary events or mass gatherings. As you all know, there are occasions where there may be events hosted at wineries, local tasting rooms, what may be, and oftentimes we see it are at those wineries that we don't have two ways of egress. And so you mentioned, you know, potentially a waiver process, but just curious if you can kind of shed a little bit more light on how you would envision this kind of applying in those situations, and what may be included as and looked at in terms of factors when looking at that waiver process.
Those are great questions. And I think, you know, areas where something is already developed, like you've mentioned, like a winery with one way in or one way out. And I'm going to speculate here, because again, we're not in a space where we're making rules, but something like the fact that there is, you know, certain geography, that property is developed a certain way, that you have one way in and one way out, and are there additional, and then so you couldn't be required to add another access for a special event, but are there opportunities, you know, to have parking off site, for example, or I'm not making things up, but I'm just trying to come up with some examples. But so don't hold me to them. But parking off site, or, you know, to have firefighting equipment on site, or to have, you know, parking areas that people can, you know, the circulation is designed well, where people could get out in an orderly way, have, you know, an evacuation plan that's been thought about in advance. And I see Sadie and Palmer are coming to add more. So please, Sadie.
Well, I won't say much because I'm sure that Palmer has some good thoughts to share. But, you know, I think when we're looking at recommendation 3, existing structures, facilities, you know, development like wineries is one place of concern. But what we heard from folks at OHCS, Oregon Housing and Community Services, is that in Southern Oregon and Talent in Phoenix, looking at safe evacuation and firefighting response was particularly impactful for large areas of mobile homes or manufactured homes, where they had 200, you know, hundreds of families living in close proximity with a single point of ingress and egress. and no easy way for a lot of people to get out. You know, maybe it connects to a neighborhood street, and then it's again a stretch to get to something like an arterial that could manage greater throughput. And so when we're envisioning kind of creating an overall more wildfire adapted and safer Oregon, yes, things like you know, special events at wineries is a concern, and we want to keep those people safe. But really, you know, we also want to consider where people are living and the vulnerability of communities and structures that are people's homes. And so that's part of this. But Palmer, please, I'm interested in your thoughts.
So I'll maybe, and then Palmer Mason, Senior Policy Advisor at DLCD, try to answer Samantha's question about the waiver process and maybe provide a little bit more detail. I mean, I think Susan had some good comments. One was, Susan made the comment about, we were thinking that the waiver process might apply so that a property owner, or really someone who's developing new property at a certain scale, wouldn't necessarily have to add an additional ingress or egress. And it could be a variety of factors. It could be something like, as she mentioned, geography. So there's a body of water, and we're not going to ask you to build a bridge over the body of water to have a second egress or ingress. You know, it could be an issue of legal access. The way the property owner or developer's property is configured, there's not a way without going through easements and so forth to get a second egress or ingress. I mean, that would be the type of factor we would want to hear from communities and property owners about, because at least to me, that might present enough of a barrier that a waiver is justified. So those are some reasons why it may not make sense to require someone to put in that second ingress or egress. On the larger issue of this recommendation, and really all of the recommendations, particularly the ones where there might be rulemaking, which again is a decision by the legislature at the end of the day on whether they are going to bless our commission going forward with rulemaking, and if we were to go through with rulemaking, under what sideboards and guardrails. One thing to think about for all of this, and I raise it because I think there were a couple questions about, well, what happens to the rebuilding that's occurring in starting in Southern Oregon now? How does this apply? You have to think about the timeline. So the department would be going to the legislature with the recommendations in 2023. We would know by, say, June or July of 2023 what kind of direction the legislature provided to our commission and what kind of sideboards to any rulemaking. Then we have to go through the rulemaking process, so that by the time you add that up, we are likely looking at a situation where rules, if that's the direction we go, again, dependent on legislative input, wouldn't really apply at the earliest until 2025. So that is something to keep in mind about any of these recommendations, particularly the ones that have the opportunity or the potential for being rulemaking.
Thank you. Samantha Bayer and then Chad, and I want to do a time check. I think when we finish this slide, I'd like to talk a bit about updating our agenda a little bit so we have more time on these slides. These questions are really great. But Samantha Bayer.
Thank you. And I know we're running out of time. So two things.
I think I can add more time. I looked at the agenda, so please ask your question.
But if we have questions that we feel like we aren't going to be able to get through today, can we follow up with those? And can we can the whole group see the questions that get sent around? I think that would just be helpful. I'm seeing nodding. Okay.
Yep.
Great. So I just want to because now I'm slightly confused. So on what Deb was saying earlier about how there might be like offsite parking or other sort of mitigation requirements, are those types of things being contemplated within this recommendation for existing uses? Or are we just looking at egress for new development?
Trying to unmute, sorry. So we are looking at So that actually, it would be under recommendation 2, where we talk about additional access for what Sadie was talking about, areas that are already developed, like a manufactured home park. For recommendation 3, we would be talking about for special events or other permitted events that not necessarily a second access would have to be required, but that the permit process would review what additional mitigation requirements would need to be in place for
And-
that special event to happen.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Chad?
Yeah, thank you, City and Susan. And I just wanted to follow up, and I apologize, I'm in my car. I'm about ready to do a town hall myself. But Chad Hawkins, Assistant Chief Deputy with State Fire Marshal's Office, just wanted to provide some clarity on kind of the code perspective, because I know we were hearing some comments about the code. So when you look at
Chad,
the code and how it's
Chad, you're
utilized
breaking
from a
up a
fire
bit.
service perspective, we work with developers at land use to determine firefighting access and water supply on those like new development type areas as you're discussing. But I just figured I'd throw that out there, that access and water supply is that, I apologize, is that any better?
Yep.
I'll switch connections. Oh, okay, great.
Yep.
I just figured I would provide, again, that concept of access and water supply, firefighting access and water supply is determined at the land use and planning stage. And the fire department folks work with the developers, work with all the local officials to come up with adequate, again, firefighting access and water supply. And then when they have events, to the previous ladies' comments, we work with those local wineries, vineyards, other assembly type occupancies to determine, the appropriate safeguards for in the event of any emergency that they have appropriate egress. So just figured I'd throw that out there, that it's already in the fire code. It's been there for a long time, but it is at, that new development, when determining for access and water supply. That's all I have. Thank you, guys.
And then Samantha, I see you have your hand up, and then I'd like to take a break to talk about the agenda.
Yeah, and so maybe Chad or the department could kind of walk through, since what Chad's saying, we do already factor most of this in. How would new rules change the process for developers? Would they have an additional local department they would have to deal with if this is, would they have to would they have to work with both the fire folks and then planning would these be separate, or would this be a streamlined process, including it all together? I think it's a little confusing to know that we're kind of already doing this, and now we're adopting an additional set of criteria or an additional process on this. So just trying to suss out what this might actually look like on the ground.
Yeah, thanks, Samantha, and thanks, Chad. What we're proposing is not an additional process. So as Chad mentioned, a permit application comes into the planning counter. The planners behind the scenes are working with their local fire departments to make sure that the development proposal, meets the Oregon Fire Code. And really what we're trying to do here, particularly with the site access, is just to elevate this as an issue that cities and counties should be making sure that this is happening in their community. We're not proposing, additional, as I said, additional standards. Really, this would be in conjunction, and it would be local governments, in consultation with the local firefighters, emergency management professionals, just to review and amend, if needed, their zoning and land division codes to make sure that these types of strategies are being employed in the areas where they make sense.
All right, Susan, I was going to propose that we have a 10-minute break on our agenda, that we skip that 10-minute break and people can get up and get coffee or use the restroom as needed. So that would be 10 additional minutes for this discussion, and that we move our breakout rooms to 11:15. And I think that gives you more time to go through these recommendations and take some more questions before we get out into the breakout room. I do want to make sure we get into the breakout rooms so we have a smaller group discussion and be able to hear from everybody on this call. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great to me.
Okay, thanks,
Thank you.
Susan.
Yeah. Yes, I'm just looking at Mary Kyle's comments. Clarify between permanent and new development and temporary uses. Yeah, I think being more clear there.
And I would suggest too, that's a great way to get comments in that maybe it's not a question, but a suggestion, is put it in the chat, because we will be taking all of this information and putting it together for DLCD.
Yes, thank you. All right, so let's go, excuse me, to recommendation number 4. And this recommendation is really focused on new development. So wildfire risk mitigation requirements for areas of new development. And this is one of those recommendations where we are referring to areas of greatest wildfire risk, pending, the future iteration of the statewide map of wildfire risk. This is likely, extreme and high risk. There may be, and again, I'm going to say this, but really without getting into rulemaking and having the map in front of us, there may be some of these recommendations that make sense in areas of moderate risk. But also as I'm talking through these, and I'd like for the small groups to discuss this as well. There are 3 kind of major buckets under this recommendation. Then there are a lot of best practices that we've included in the write-up, and some may be, really more, we may get the biggest bang for our buck from some of those specific potential requirements. Others may be like, well, this would be great if communities did this, but it's not as impactful. And so that's the type of feedback that we're hoping to get, particularly from our local government partners, and over the coming month as well from folks that are commenting on the recommendations report. And so in those areas of greatest wildfire risk, this recommendation would ask that cities and counties review and amend comprehensive plan policies, and they're implementing land use codes for new development to incorporate requirements and standards to reduce wildfire risk, ensure the provision of services such as adequate water supply and pressure to fight fires, and limit the siting of facilities with concentrated vulnerable populations, critical facilities, infrastructure, and lifelines, and facilities with hazardous materials that could be highly flammable. So if we could go to the next slide. And I see Samantha, you had a question?
Yeah, so sorry, I have a agenda question. So we're just going to quickly go through these at a high level and then go to the breakout groups, or are we going to have more time to talk as a full group about each of the recommendations?
Yeah, I think what we're doing right now, if you have a question about this or a comment while Susan's doing it, please ask. We've added some more time for that so everybody can hear it. The idea with the small breakout rooms is so that more people who are on this call would have a chance to ask questions and interact with a DLCD representative. And we are going to consolidate all the comments from chat, from this discussion here, and from the breakout rooms, and can send them out to this group.
Okay. Can we go back to the last slide?
Back one more.
So I have a lot of questions about these 3 bullet points, because they're
and then we can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, why don't you do that in the breakout room?
Okay,
great. Yeah.
Yeah, And I'll add, Samantha, so the next couple of slides, I go into a little more detail about each of these. So hopefully that will answer some of your questions. And I will note after we do the small group breakout discussions, then we'll come back and each of the groups will be reporting out so we can hear.
Yeah. I think that might be, I was thinking with the time that we might not have much time for that.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. All
I have
right.
a question in the chat from Dave.
Yeah. Hi, Dave. I think let me walk through the next couple of slides and then come back to your question, if that's okay. Yeah. Great. All right. So, and this does have a lot of detail, but under that kind of requiring land use wildfire mitigation standards for new development. This would include in the future rebuilding after a natural disaster. We've noted that the standards and requirements may differ depending on the scale of development. So to get to that question of someone building, a single home in a forest zone versus, a new subdivision, there would be a different level of applicability potentially. Some would not apply. But the types of things that we're talking about that are detailed in the write-up you receive, we're talking about land use and land division approval standards that might require like clustering of structures in an area of lowest risk on a large site. This could be structure spacing standards, density modification and other types of flexibility for new subdivisions, planned unit developments, and manufactured home parks. Again, in that kind of that level of planning for, a new development or subdivision, local code could have requirements for landscape scale community protection fire breaks on the perimeter of a development. Are there natural features or open space that the developers and designers, landscape architects could be looking at to kind of serve double duty as fire breaks? So really trying to get this type of planning in the forefront of people's minds. And then this would be kind of a community scale landscape treatment using those natural features, or a road or a golf course for a fire break. And this would be something that would be, again, at the community scale and in addition to any defensible space requirements on individual lots, which are under the purview of the defensible space code that the Office of State Fire Marshal is working on right now. We are also talking about setbacks and home siting standards in forested areas that account for slope steepness, buffers between structures to reduce ignition risk, and setbacks from adjacent forest lands. And this is actually, these are standards that are in many existing county codes for forest zones. Would it make sense in other, areas that are within extreme or high risk to look at that as well?
Susan, there's a question if the mitigation standards for new development, will it apply to commercial and ag buildings or just residences?
We are contemplating that this would apply to all new development. So like a mixed use or commercial type of development, office park, yes, that it would apply for agricultural buildings. I know that there are certain types of agricultural buildings that are exempt from certain development standards. And so this, our recommendations would be in line with existing Oregon statute in regard to agricultural buildings.
Okay, thank you.
Again, thinking about, what we can do to prevent wildfire from spreading in the event of a wildfire in an adjacent area to a new development, landscaping standards for fire resistant plants and requirements for hazardous vegetation management plans, like from a homeowners association. That might be a strategy that a local government could employ. And really looking at water service. So we know that our communities plan for future water needs, but are they planning in a way that's looking at increased need for the provision of water to certain areas that might be needed for fighting wildfires? Are the existing requirements for water supply and hydrant placement, do those make sense if an area is at a higher risk? And for areas that aren't served by water service, on-site water storage and proof of adequate water supply for firefighting. And as Chad mentioned, that's something that the local fire department or district will look at when an application comes in for development review. Some counties actually have standards in their development codes to address this as well. So really trying to harmonize that. And we're also looking at ways to support expedited rebuilding in areas that have been impacted by natural hazards, wildfire and related risks. So, rebuilding to the existing code, which we're hoping, in the future is a higher level for wildfire mitigation. But are there other processes that a local government could consider in their approval process to help expedite rebuilding?
So 2 quick questions. Does the Senate bill limit rulemaking to new developments? Is that why mitigation is not considered for previously developed areas? And who and how will fire resistant plant requirements be enforced?
Great questions. To Sharice's question, Senate Bill 762 does not limit rulemaking to new development. And however, we have been looking at opportunities to really have the most impact, moving forward, and have looked at new development as a place where communities can look forward to being more wildfire adapted. Certainly risk mitigation in areas of existing development through defensible space, that will apply through the work that the state fire marshal is doing. Communities as well as any rebuilding in those extreme and high risk areas, residential rebuilding will have to comply with the new Oregon Residential Specialty Code for home hardening. Some of the, as we were talking about, the evacuation planning and possibility of requiring a second access, that could apply in areas that are already developed. But I think the lift to retroactively ask people to comply with a standard, that would be, I think, very challenging for a variety of reasons. And then the other question from Samantha, let's see. Who and how will fire resistant plant requirements be enforced? So that would depend, Samantha, on the local government and how they organize their development code. Some cities or counties have, that Kelly has a response to. They may have requirements at development, and someone goes out and inspects the site, before granting the final occupancy or land use permit, and they're comparing it against a planting plan, and everything looks good. In 2 years, who knows what people have dug up and replanted. So that is a tough one, as Kelly notes in the chat about getting people to plant the correct vegetation, like in natural resource areas. So I think that's more of a local conversation about how they might meet that type of requirement.
So are we ready to, any other questions before we go on to the next slide?
Yeah, Libby, I'm just gonna
Sure.
say couple more comments about this one. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I will note that one of our recommendations does ask that, in particular counties, that we would ask, and some cities, but counties, to review their current land use code to make sure that any references they have included in their codes to defensible space standards, and some counties do have those types of standards in their codes, that they review and make sure that those standards are up to date to meet the new defensible space standards, the minimum statewide standard. And also just to highlight that a local government could, under Senate Bill 762, adopt additional standards that meet the International Wildland Urban Interface Code. And I think the last couple of things, it's more broadly about the provision of services and when we're thinking about wildfire risk when planning, developing, or improving or replacing public facilities and services, that wildfire resiliency should be a primary consideration. So not just water, but sewer, transportation, communication facilities. Can communities doing long-range planning really think about those areas of highest or higher wildfire risk and make some, strategic decisions about where those types of resources are located in the future? All right, next slide, please.
And I was wondering if Tanner could respond to Kurt's question in the chat. All right, Susan.
Okay, oh, he's going to respond in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so recommendation 5. And so with this recommendation, we're really trying to look at ways that DLCD through technical assistance and grants can provide additional support and staffing capacity, additional support for post-disaster recovery in local communities through recovery planning services. So doing recovery planning before a disaster happens is very important at the local level. And are there ways that DLCD can develop a programmatic approach to support cities and counties through this pre-planning? Also, are there additional ways that we can assist communities post-wildfire or other disasters through the provision of professional services, like identifying planning consultants and providing funding to local governments to have folks come in and work the permit counter, when they're inundated with rebuilding permits after wildfire, and to really look at that pre-disaster recovery planning, not only, how areas will rebuild, but does the local government have, does the city or county have processes in place, for how they will approach recovery planning, and really to think about those things, not in an emergency situation, but really when there's time for the a broader engagement in that process. Trying to think.
Susan, we have Tanner has his hand up, and then we have 2 questions that relate back to your last slide. So we'll just go back for 1 second, but Tanner first.
Thank you. I was just going to respond to Kurt's question, and hopefully not stepping on Chad's toes too much, and he can step in if he needs to. But yeah, basically, fire code requires there to be adequate water supply. So access and water supply is, I think Chad mentioned. So on the water supply side, it kind of breaks it down into kind of a normal like city water supply versus rural areas that don't have that water supply. And I believe 1142 is kind of referenced, not necessarily required, but basically I think it says you've got to have some sort of a water supply. That gets, there's some complexities to that, especially in more rural areas where you don't have those kind of standard water supplies. But effectively, yeah, 1142 addresses water supply. Typically what we see for that is, underground or above ground tank that provides the stored water volume necessary for that site. Hopefully that answers the question. If there's anything else I need to add, happy to do that. And if Chad needs to clarify that, I'm sure he'll jump on and do that. Thanks.
All right, and Dave had just a question about if you do a pole barn, farm stand, or minor development, that a condition of approval might be a landscape remodel.
Oops, sorry, I'm catching up.
Yep.
Let's see, landscape. I don't know yet, Dave. I think, again, and this, someone was addressing this in the chat above, that I believe we are talking about new development, so not removing existing landscaping. I mean, if there is something under defensible space that would make sense, then that certainly would apply to that existing development. Pole bar, yeah. But that's something to keep in mind. That would be more of a detail in rulemaking.
Yep. And then Samantha's question goes back to your fourth bullet that said prohibit comprehensive plan or zone map amendments that would result in increased residential densities or more intensive uses in areas of greatest wildfire risk unless additional mitigation is implemented.
Yes, thank you. I realized that I kind of glossed over that, and that is important. So thank you for bringing that up, Samantha. So with this bullet under recommendation 4, we are really trying to emphasize that there may be areas that are currently zoned a certain way for, it might be a resource land, so farm or forest land. And if those areas are being proposed for a rezone or comprehensive plan map amendment, that would result in additional residential density or more intensive uses, that it would make sense in those areas to require additional mitigation standards. And what this doesn't really address is, we're talking about primarily areas of greatest risk. So really trying to take into account what would increase the potential exposure to people and property in these areas that are at greatest risk for wild.
Okay, and Samantha, you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I'm just gonna, I mean, I've said this before in this setting and then in other groups as well, that I've expressed concern about there being anti-development proposals through this or prohibiting residential development in areas where we know there's going to be fire risk. We just talked about earlier that it doesn't really matter if you're in low, moderate, or high, you're always at risk of wildfire. And that's why we have hardening standards. That's why we have defensible space. And I felt like in a previous meeting with the department, it was, expressed that we wouldn't be going this far. And so it's disappointing to see this included in the recommendations.
Thank you, Samantha. Mary Kyle?
Well, I don't read this as prohibiting development, but when I read this, I thought of things like a destination resort that's proposed to be located in an area of highest wildfire risk. That probably should have additional mitigation measures required of it. That's how I was thinking of this. So I think obviously this is a general concept for further conversation and in detail, but I think it's appropriate to consider it, to include it, because that was an example that came to mind to me. Yeah, you might have a higher degree of water requirement, more ingress and egress points, more education required, et cetera, because that's a mix of permanent and tourist people and a lot of them. So anyway, I just think it's appropriate to keep it, and it seems that it could impact. It's not clear, I just go anyway. That's all.
Dave? Thank you, Mary Kyle.
Yeah, if what Mary Kyle says is correct, then I suggest that you rewrite that, because the language says that you're prohibiting comp plan or zone map amendments. The way I read that, prohibit means prohibit, which means a UGB expansion wouldn't be allowed, which means you're probably going to need to change the priority, ask the legislature to change the priority statutes. I think it also would prohibit any kind of exception, goal 3 or 4 exception. And so if you intend it to be that broad, then I think that's what the language that you wrote provides. If you intend to narrow it or intend it not to be as broad as what I just suggested, then maybe I just suggest that you make that clear.
Thank you, Dave. If we can go back to slide 5, to the recommendation 5 again. And Susan, would you like to close out this slide, or do you have additional information?
Let me see where I was. I think the thing I will note about this recommendation, in addition to kind of the tools and resources that we've identified for the other recommendations, which is, technical assistance, grant funding, a model code. I didn't really actually go into detail of what those toolbox items and resources might include, but for this under recovery planning, we think it's important to call out as an additional resource or tool would be state financial assistance to local governments for targeted property acquisition or buyouts of properties with repeat or overlapping impact from wildfire and related natural hazards. And that would be, a program that would be developed locally to determine if there are areas. Certainly funding would be a huge element of having some type of property acquisition program.
Thank you. I wanted to note that Kurt and Melanie have topics in the chat that I think would be great for the breakout room. But Susan, do you want to take a look at them right now? The first one relates to how the wildfire risk map overlays with current zoning and urban growth boundaries, struggling to understand the potential impact to the recommendations given current laws. And Melanie's question about that each county and city will interpret every new rule their own way, so it gets very muddy.
Yeah, I can address these real quickly. Kurt, that's an excellent observation, and what we're hoping to do when we do have the statewide map of wildfire risk is for DLCD to do some GIS analysis. So really looking at, we were able to visually look at the maps and see like where urban growth boundaries are and in relation to the risk areas and the wildland urban interface. We're not talking about, necessarily changes to zoning, but within those zoning districts, that with recommendation for that cities and counties are looking at their codes to make sure that wildfire risk is addressed in those zones as appropriate for the underlying zoning. And so it would be really working within the existing framework to make updates to plans and codes to incorporate additional standards.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then for Melanie's statement, I think if DLCD is directed and moves into rulemaking at that level, we would get into some very specific requirements. If we are going a regulatory approach, if there's a voluntary approach, we also would have guidance and kind of a baseline set of standards that we would ask local governments to incorporate in any updates to comprehensive plans and development codes if they wanted to access technical assistance and grant resources. If it's voluntary, it would be up to cities and counties to if they don't want support from the agency, we don't really have a lever to ask them to do things a certain way. But if it is, rulemaking and we're directed to, go more the regulatory approach, then there would be a minimum baseline that cities and counties would have to comply with.
Okay, so the next slide is actually your last slide.
It is, oops, I went too far on mine. So our last recommendation is really more broadly looking at how communities plan for addressing natural hazards. So this recommendation is to increase the effectiveness of natural hazards planning through better coordination of the processes locally to develop community wildfire protection plans and natural hazard mitigation plans. And then for local governments to then be able to take policies and strategies or priorities that come out of that kind of coordinated planning process and integrate those policies or adopt those policies that are appropriate into comprehensive plans, and then having implementation actions in actionable codes. So in the development code, zoning code, subdivision ordinance. And so it's more about the process to develop those plans. Communities, special districts, tribes update their natural hazard mitigation plans every 5 years if they want to remain eligible for hazard mitigation grant money from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Community wildfire protection plans are developed in some communities to enable those communities to receive funding from the Forest Service that comes through the Oregon Department of Forestry to address. Those plans are more focused on like fuel reduction and looking at forested areas around communities. And so they do a lot of analysis that could be better integrated into the broader natural hazard mitigation planning effort. And our department has several staff that work with cities and counties, special districts, and tribes on developing natural hazard mitigation plans, and it's a multi-year process. The University of Oregon also supports many communities doing this type of work, so we've been meeting with staff from the U of O to think about ways that this process could be more streamlined to help communities be more efficient in how they do their planning process, and also having the wildfire protection plan integrated with the natural hazard mitigation planning process will bring more voices to the table, and they could have one planning committee locally to work through that process instead of having two different processes that don't always mesh. And I think what we are proposing is we have a couple pilot projects working through this process right now in 2 counties in Oregon, and looking to the legislature if they feel that this is important to provide additional resources to DLCD and the University of Oregon department that does this work to take what's learned from the pilot projects and come up with an approach that can be used in other communities going forward, and coming with the outcome of more actionable policies and strategies to reduce risk from wildfires. So I think that's all I have on that one. Oh, there's I see
questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Commissioner. Lynn and Benton County are currently participating in a pilot project to do that integration of the wildfire protection plan and natural hazard mitigation plan.
All right. Any questions? Tammy, you can skip over the break slide and go to the group feedback on recommendations. And actually the next slide. So when we go into breakout rooms, I'd have to say the comments have been and the questions have been great up to now. So we're going to continue it just in a smaller group session. So people we haven't already heard from, we're hoping that there are more will have a chance to participate and ask more questions. The feedback questions we're looking for, any general observations or questions, what are your major concerns? I think we've heard a few of them already today. Are there additional ideas for implementation activities? That is going to help DLCD determine local and state resources and timelines that may be needed. And there are some examples here: inventory and analysis work, community engagement resources, review and update of comp plans and codes, model codes and guidance, technical assistance, grant support. So they are seeking your ideas about what other resources should be considered. What are the barriers to implementation? We've also seen some of those come up here in our discussion as a group. And anything else that you'd like to share in the small group breakout rooms. And are there any questions before we split into smaller groups? Anyway, thank you, Susan. That was a great presentation. Thank you. So Trish, if you can split us up into groups. I think, let me look at the time. So we have, it's 11 o'clock. So we can do our breakout rooms. Let's do them for 40 minutes. And then that will take us to 11:40, and we would be able to come back as a group and just for a few minutes share any big takeaways. Does that
Perfect.
sound good, Susan and Sadie? Okay.
All right. Breakout rooms are open. Hey, Court, do you remember what room you were in? Welcome back, everyone. We'll just give everyone else the remaining 20 seconds to come back.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. It's 11:40, so we have some time for some report back. Report out. Yep, we can take that down. Thank you for the reminder. That's helpful to me. We will still on the agenda is to look over Susan's going to go over the engagement, the schedule and next steps, and what happens next. So we'll save some time for that. Probably about 10 minutes. So 10 minutes for report back, and I'll call on a room. Susan, your room. Who was your facilitator?
Yeah, it was Tammy and I.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't know, Tammy, if you want to start out, and then I was taking copious notes as well, which I can talk at high level about.
Yeah,
So I think one of the big things that came from our room was around the issue of communications and integrating the different agencies that are working on the different wildfire topics. I think those were the two takeaways that I came away from. And Susan, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I would echo that. And we talked quite a bit about kind of evacuation planning and the importance of communication. And it was shared that the communities aren't necessarily required to do evacuation planning. And even with the best evacuation plans in place, understanding how the transportation network may be deficient and addressing that, that the communications piece is just supremely critical for not only educating people in advance, but in that aftermath, of a fire where people maybe aren't getting information right away, but that they've been informed and educated about how to evacuate. They understand if there's a zone, where they should generally be trying to go, not specific routes. We also did talk about, overall coordination between agencies at the state level, and some good feedback, about some areas we can be a little more specific in our recommendations, and really trying to continue to focus on areas of existing development and what can be done, as well as new development. And also some questions about kind of consequences if local governments aren't following certain rules, and what are, some remedies for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and also talking about our natural environment as well, including that in the plan.
Yes, and climate change.
Climate change. Wow, all of that. Thank you, Tammy and Susan. Martin.
We had some really, I think, lively discussion and really interesting feedback in our room. One of the things that we heard over and over again was really making sure that we're focusing on the areas of greatest risk. Also heard some thankfulness from local jurisdictions saying that they kind of need a baseline, because otherwise this ends up becoming kind of a balkanized approach. So really want to hear something from the state on kind of what should be the baseline. Say again, did I miss anything? I know we heard a lot.
We did hear a lot. No, those were good report outs. We did talk a lot too about the cost to local government, but also the cost to a private property owner, a homeowner, people that are going to be charged with potentially implementing these measures on their own, and the Venn diagram between vulnerable communities and areas at risk, and how we need to be especially mindful of implementation costs to a property owner when we're looking at that population. And then we talked too about, with the coordination between state agencies, but also coordination between counties or cities in terms of evacuation planning. I mean, I think Mary Kyle made the point earlier in this meeting that this is really something we need to address at a regional level, because you just don't know where you're going to have impacted communities and where you're going to need to tap into the resources of a neighboring region or county. And then we had a comment near the end of our breakout room that I thought was very helpful and sort of goes back to the impact on our vulnerable communities. And that is that there's often an appetite to do the work and to say, maybe, you know, establish the defensible space, but a lot of the grant money that is available is a reimbursement and not money that's available up front. And so if you're having to, you know, put down $10,000 of your own money to establish these defensible space standards, that just might be something that's out of reach for some community members. And I thought that, you know, thinking about funding access in that way was helpful for me.
Thank you, Sadie and Martin. Our group, I think we talked about several issues, including water supply, housing, fire service. And the big thing that came out of it, I think, is that some of these recommendations need some additional clarification. And there was an idea for some small group meetings to dive into the details and address potential issues and make sure that the language is clear about what's being recommended. And I'll actually turn it over to Palmer and Matt to talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think Libby, you hit the most important takeaway. I think we heard from several folks that they want to explore more in recommendation 4 around the department's ideas around ensuring adequate access for firefighting equipment. And then this may also be parts of recommendation 3 too. So it's probably 3 and 4. Access for firefighting equipment, water supply, possibly even safe evacuation for those type of standards and best practices for new development. I think at the department, we're wondering if there are some gaps and how all of the things that we do align well with the land use planning program, and particularly when you're at the community level planning for future development, not at the individual application level, the individual property owner. But it was definitely evident that we need to do more work there, and we need to sort of go through that gap analysis and better understand what happens now and what our proposals, how they might really add value.
Thank you, Paul.
The other thing I would say quickly, sorry, is we heard about, you know, concerns around how the scope and number of recommendations might have an impact on individual property owners, their cost, as well as the lack of housing options in Oregon. So I do think we need to maybe make a little more clear in the report that we recognize that. And it was suggested, and we'll definitely take up that suggestion, to have more one-on-one conversations about those concerns.
Thank you. Matt, anything to add?
Nope, you've covered it.
All right, thank you. Tammy, do you want to bring up the presentation again, and we will move to the schedule. And Susan, this is yours.
Thanks, Libby. Shifting from taking notes to talking with you guys again. Yeah, so you can see, you've seen this iterations of this slide before, but I do want to note, so here is an overview of our process to date. We're just having our last stakeholder group meeting. And again, thank you all for your time and feedback today. It's been very helpful. We also heard some feedback over the last couple of weeks that it would make sense for us to have another opportunity for a broader community feedback and a listening session. So we are scheduling 2 statewide virtual community listening sessions for September 8th. And we'll have one in the morning and one in the evening, where we can review the recommendations in a similar fashion as we did with you all today. It'll probably be a little more high level, but to provide folks an opportunity to hear about the recommendations in addition to reviewing them, you know, on paper and have conversations. And moving forward, our survey is wrapping up. That we'll keep that open. We are also working to organize a Spanish language focus group through a community-based organization in Southern Oregon over the coming weeks. So continuing to receive feedback and public comment, which will take, if we could go to the next slide, please. So our draft recommendations report. So we're going to be furiously working over the next 2 days to take some of the feedback from today's meeting and incorporate that into the draft recommendations and the full report, which also has that background section that will be available to the public this Friday. And we'll be doing sharing that broadly through our Gov delivery, press release, sharing with our various email lists that we've gathered over the last several months, and of course with you all. And we have about a 4-week written public comment period. Trisha just shared Trisha or Tammy shared the link in the chat, which has that link to the public comment form. So I actually got the first public comment today. I hadn't gotten any yet, so I'm going to go back and read that. But we'll then be taking all of the written public comment, as well as we are scheduling one-on-one stakeholder interviews. So with members of this group who expressed interest, with other organizations, with key legislators over this month. And all of that will be wrapped into our updated recommendations report. I will note that the public comment period closes September 16th, which is after we're preparing our updated report for the Land Conservation and Development Commission for their September 22nd meeting. So we'll be giving them a verbal update on what we heard, anything received, after we've put that final updated report together for them. And then at that commission meeting in September, verbal public comment will be accepted. So folks still will have an opportunity to continue to provide feedback to the commission around the recommendations. We're giving an update to the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council on September 26th, and kind of a briefing on where we are, and all of that will go into our report due October 1st. And if we could go to the next slide real quick. And this has been, mentioned several times in different ways, but just again, to be clear, everything that we're working on that you all have been helping with goes to the legislature for their consideration during the next legislative session. And ideally, they're providing feedback to the department and giving us some parameters under which we can help narrow our focus, because this is a lot of work for the agency. It's, potentially has a lot of impact across the state. So we are looking for guidance from the legislature, what they feel is most important to focus on. And as I mentioned, also the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council, they are working on their annual report to the legislature, which is due at the end of October. So they've been meeting with all the different state agencies to get updates on their work, and that is going into their update and further recommendations for the legislature's consideration as well. And coming out of that process, there's potential rulemaking down the road, 2024, it could take a year or two, with potential implementation in 2025 and ongoing. And certainly we're checking in with our commission all along the way, and any potential rulemaking that DLCD does would certainly be at the direction of our commission, and as we do with our rulemaking, really a robust community engagement process to really help to inform and shape any rules that we would come up with. And I think we can go to the next slide. Yep. And again, here's the link for the public comment form. It's also on our website, and with each meeting date, people have had access to use that public comment form. We may have people who are watching on YouTube. So if you do have comments and you're watching this streaming, please feel free to use that public comment form to get us your feedback. And I think the last slide, please. And again, just want to thank everyone for their time today, to our stakeholder group members, for our agency partners, DLCD staff, our consultant team for really helping help us have our stakeholder group meetings run smoothly and in a way where we can get the most feedback from everybody as we can in the limited amount of time that we have. And my phone number and email are also on this slide. And I will note, someone asked this in the chat, but we will be posting a PDF of this presentation on the website in the next day or two. And all of the presentations are available on our website as well. The YouTube link will include, it has a link to the recording that's been made today as well. So lots of information out there, and please don't hesitate to contact me or any of my colleagues at DLCD with any questions or concerns or for additional information.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, everybody. We can adjourn.
Thanks, everybody.